Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as we let the room fill in a bit. So just hang tight, introduce yourselves in the chat if you want, but we'll get started at about 12:02 or 12:03, just to let the room fill in. But thank you for being here. Hello, everyone. Thank you for those that have just joined us. We're just waiting a couple of minutes as we let the room fill. I'm going to keep repeating the message a couple of times, but just hang back. We'll get started shortly. Introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Hello, welcome to those of you that are just joining us. We're giving it just a couple of minutes before we get started, just to let the room fill. So just feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like, or just hang tight. We'll get started in just a bit. Thank you for being here. Thank you for those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in about a minute. We're just letting the room fill in, waiting for some late arrivals. Just hang tight. We'll get started shortly. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our Intro to Tech Equity webinar. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity. And I hope y'all can hear and see me. Let me know in the chat if you are having any tech difficulties. I'm the community manager at TechEquity. So in my role, I get to engage with our supporters, events, presentations such as these, and throughout various volunteer opportunities and engagements. And I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A as we go, but we won't answer those questions until the end. The webinar will be recorded and the slides will be shared out afterwards. So the recording and the slides will be given to you all in an email shortly this afternoon after the webinar. So a little bit about what we'll be covering today. We'll be talking about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address some of our most pressing economic issues. But first, let's start with why we're here. Well, TechEquity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods, and they understood that there was this perception that tech workers were the cause of the problem. So they noticed things such as rising rents, displacement, traffic, and more people experiencing homelessness in their communities. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they as tech workers were uniquely positioned to help contribute to some of these solutions. And especially now in the face of the pandemic that we're currently going through, we're seeing that this affordability crisis is getting so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. Many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. And at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. And as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate some of the inequality that our region was already seeing, that some of our founding members were seeing as well. So because of this affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, And I've kind of been able to see both sides of the coin where I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and in their neighborhoods and are worried about what that means for them. But I also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame for our region's issues, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that's further dividing communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide. And while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal that's caused by the pandemic, that's amplifying our affordability crisis, like we just talked about, it's important to note that many within the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. And I think that the fact that rents are rising isn't really a surprise to anyone on this call because we already know this, we feel this, we've heard this from friends and family. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. And we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based and it's where tech is headquartered, but a version of this story is playing out all across the country. And it really is a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. Before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims had spiked 16%. That's a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So in the span of about a month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. However, at TechEquity, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities. We have to show up and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At TechEquity, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. So we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar and showing up to learn a little bit more. Our goal at TechEquity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. We help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in the system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do this in a variety of ways through some of our book club discussions, panel discussions with experts, webinars, voter guides, blog, different types of content that folks can read, see, hear, to just really learn about our equity issues here in the Bay Area. We advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. So a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we worked in partnership and in coalition with relevant stakeholders, people affected by rising rents, state legislators, and just a huge coalition of people that now extends protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community through our corporate partnerships and engagements we have with tech companies. Tech workers have this outsized political power that is largely untapped when it comes to public policy and advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practice in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At Tech Equity Collaborative, our two key issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. Our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic. And we're all well positioned to adapt our agendas to these new realities. While the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about the history of inequity within our own neighborhoods. This affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for the level of pain in that our community is feeling, and especially now with the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and all throughout the country, and that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, was giving neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And the policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. As we can see with the image of San Francisco, all those red blocks are redlined neighborhoods. And those communities were deemed risky investments or redlined and therefore didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and it really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory policy and a racist policy, and it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. There's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have historically been underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. The crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. Like I said, it extends all across California and the country. So these are examples of redline neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, two cities that are currently seeing a rise in with the tech industry. So once again, all those red blocks are redline neighborhoods in both cities. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in redline neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be something like a huge rent increase, you suddenly lose your job, you have maybe your car breaks down, things like that. And it impacts about 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are currently in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates, with 67% of Latino households in liquid asset poverty and 63% of African American households in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why all this is happening. Many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcome of the pandemic. Many people in our community were already struggling, and as the pandemic recovery continues to starkly be uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. As we can see, the hourly pay for workers has also not increased much in the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. This means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. While all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. While there's a gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a pay gap between race. White men are earning more cents to the dollar, that's that orange bar on the left side of your screen, in comparison to Black men and women, the blue bar is on the right side of your screen. So because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in cities that are providing good jobs. So the cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom working a regular, normal 8-hour day. However, if you're earning minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. Again, if you're earning minimum wage, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up an impossible situation for low wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work in. And the problem persists all across the country. Even though costs in burgeoning tech cities like Austin, Denver, Atlanta aren't as high as the Bay Area, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone that's earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or in marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment, but why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply, and this chart is showing us what we should be building. The state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build in order to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job of meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the two small red bars on the left side of your screen. So as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from our region altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. Because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities at higher rates while people with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, those are the orange bars on the left, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation. That's that last bar at the bottom, where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco and they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's why that last blue bar is actually increasing, because there is not enough affordable housing available to help support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are even more tragic. So as we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at much higher rates. Furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. But it's a combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, lack of affordable housing production, and really has created a crisis of displacement. So displacement, like we talked about, is driven by policy choices. And we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise, especially as the pandemic continues to progress. The folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs most of the time, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. The good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. Together, we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems, and we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of years and years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production. Building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build homes. Preservation, making sure that we're providing resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing stock that we have. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the necessary housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing so that we can craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we have to be thinking about short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors are more at risk than ever as a result of the pandemic, like we've been talking about. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits, regardless of what role people are in. And we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse, contracted workers. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we have created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, and making sure that the workplace is safe, and ensuring that there's fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. Training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. In order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative for the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. We need to strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved with Tech Equity. We have educational events that we throw and social events as well. Our last event of the year is actually going to be next week. It's a holiday happy hour. If you're interested in public policy, you can support our contract worker disparity project, supporting fellow contracted workers at your company. And for corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So like I said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email afterwards, and we can connect you with our corporate partnerships manager if that's any of interest to you all. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, but while building community in the process. So this year we're excited, and in 2022 as well, to continue our work in the housing and labor spaces through creating ethical work practices in tech, tackling algorithmic bias in housing that's further driving inequality and upholding systemic racism in the housing market, and crucial housing policies that are protecting and bringing relief to our most vulnerable communities. So what can you do today? You can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can support us financially by becoming a member, or you can take action with us by becoming a civic tech volunteer, supporting some of our efforts with the Contract Worker Disparity Project, or just any way you or capacity you have to volunteer. That would be a great way to support us. So now I'll talk about some of the priority legislation we worked on this year. So we'll begin with the rental registry. Tech Equity is committed to getting better data about our housing market. Better data means that we can build more accurate policy interventions and ensure that help is being targeted to people who need it the most. And Tech Equity is working on a number of campaigns to get better data on housing and ensure that data is being used fairly through our rent registry and algorithmic bias in housing initiatives. So this year we ran a bill, AB 1188, that unfortunately stalled out in the legislative process this year. So we plan to continue to pursue establishing a rent registry and make sure you subscribe to our newsletter or join our Slack just to stay updated on the progress of this, the next legislative session in 2022. We also supported legislation that relates back to our core issues of housing and workforce and labor. So this year we decided to focus our advocacy on these bills because they would have the most to ensure an affordable home, a family sustaining job, and a true safety net are available to all Californians. So if you'd like more information on the bills we supported this year, I'll be including the links to those so you have more information and you can sign on as supporters or just get a little bit of a glimpse of what we've been working on. And like I said, for upcoming events, we have our last event of the year. It's our Tech Equity Holiday Happy Hours. So that's next week, Thursday, December 16th from 5 to 6, so in the evening after work. So we'll recap what we accomplished this year and what we look forward to in 2022. We'll have facilitated debrief time and discussion with Q&A with some of our staff on there. And we'll also hear words from our founder, Catherine Bracey. So if you're interested in that and you'd like to see more faces of who's working at Tech Equity, it's a good time to hop on over, end the year, and just talk with other tech workers and other Tech Equity staff. So as I mentioned, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, you can join us as a member, or you can take action with us in whatever volunteer capacity you can. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out a follow-up email afterwards. So if you're just looking to see what volunteer opportunities you have available or what you can do today, you can also reply to that and I'll get you pointed in the right direction. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information. So we have a couple of minutes for questions if you have any. If you don't have any questions right now, that's okay too. You can also ask your questions via email by replying. So I'll just take a second to see if anyone has questions. And like I said, it's okay if you don't. Cool, no questions. And thank you, Chris, for the compliment. Awesome. So I want to thank everyone for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join our growing movement. Keep an eye out for that email. Will be going out in a couple of hours or in the afternoon. And you can always, like I said, respond back with questions you have, or if you're just interested in what volunteer opportunities we have, I can point you in the right direction. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday. Enjoy your weekend and hope to see you at a future event or with a future volunteer opportunity. Thank you.